remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchant. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you. Hello, Cheeky Natives. Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. I'm so excited for tonight's conversation. I have the esteemed honor of introducing our guest tonight, who is Mubanga Kalimamukwento. Mubanga was born in Lusaka, Zambia. Her creative work has appeared or is forthcoming in Ada, in Asterix, Contemporary Verse, on Netflix, and elsewhere. And her editorial work can be found or is forthcoming in Shenandoah, The Waterstone Review, Duke Literary Magazine, and Safundi. She founded Ubwali Literary Magazine and co-founded the Idembeka Creative Writing Workshop. When she's not writing or editing, Mubanga serves as a mentor at the Minnesota Prison Writing Workshop. She's a PhD student in the Department of Gender, Women and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, where she's also an interdisciplinary center for the study of global change scholar. Mubanga lives in Minnesota with her husband and two children. Is the author of Obligations to the Wounded, which is the book that we are discussing today, and is the winner of the Drew Hines Literature Prize for 2024 and the winner of the Minnesota Book Award for 2025. So congratulations, Mubanga, and we're so excited to have you on the Cheeky Natives. Welcome.
Hi, Alma.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
We're very excited for today's conversation. Such a beautiful place.
It's good to be back, but it's good to have both of you in the same space.
First question, I think, is like, how does it feel to be a bunch of winner, right? Like your debut novel won a prize, your collection of short story won a prize. Like, how does it feel to be a winner?
Of course, it's an honor. I'm grateful that these people who select these prizes read my work and found it worthy for the prizes that they gave it. But I also like to say that when we were submitting my forthcoming novel, I was telling my agent that I feel like prizes have been kinder to me than just like cold submissions to editors. Because with my first book, I had submitted it to several agents, several editors, and it didn't really get a bite until the prize. The same thing happened with my short story collection. I had sent it around, and then the prize is like, yeah. So I feel like prizes have been kinder to me than other methods of submission, which is just how it's ended up.
How does that make you feel, right, to know that you are writing award-winning books? You're saying they've been kinder, but like they're also award-winning. Like it's not they just did something. No, you've actually won a prize.
Prizes. This is not the time to be shy, Mubanga.
Shy. No, I am the person who I was saying when I was in Pittsburgh the other week that when they called me to tell me that I had won the Drew Hines Prize, they didn't even finish like explaining, because they call you and they're like, yeah, we're letting you know, but we're going to make the announcement on this day. So don't tell anybody yet, whatever. They had to repeat that multiple times because I was screaming on the call. All I heard was, you are the winner of, and I was like, but the only thing that stopped me was my neighbor. I was away from home and I was in an apartment. So I had like someone banged on either a wall or this roof. I don't know what. And that's what stopped me. I think what it is that because usually, except for Dinani where they announced it right that moment. So I was processing in the moment. Usually with prizes, you're told like a few weeks or a few months before. So my processing space is private. So by the time the like announcement is being made, like I've collected myself and things like that. When I'm writing the book, I don't think I'm thinking that far. Like I'm just like swallowed up in that world that I'm just trying to look to the end of the book. Okay, how do I get to the end of this project and come out, breathe? And then it's like a step by step. And with a lot of these prizes too, they have come at a moment when I'm almost like, you know what, I give up on this project. I'm just gonna set it aside. And then somebody's, yay, we love it. So there's a lot of like feelings involved, but always a great honor, lots of excitement in the moment. And a lot of them too have been reading the books, like the previous books that have won.
So speaking of the book, to get into it, I think that this book is interesting because for two reasons. The first is that the book feels like a love letter to Zambian women and young girls. But the book is also set in multiple physical locations in Zambia. So there's the urban setting, there's a setting in a village, etc. And I'm very intrigued about being a person who writes about a home you no longer live in, because a lot of that is also writing from a place of memory. So I wanted to know, what is the relationship, particularly in this book, between place, geographical, but also between memory in these stories, because it's an interesting relationship that they have.
All the stories were written at a different time, right? So where I was, even in like a recollection of the space that I was writing about, was different. So, for example, Inswa was the first short story that I ever wrote, maybe like a month or two after I had left Zambia. So it's very like fresh in my mind in that way. But Inswa is also based in 1965, before I was born. And it's also based in a location that I have never lived before. So there was a lot of asking questions: who would recognize the landscape, and they would review the text for me to see what was working and what wasn't working. Sometimes I do make great use of my community. So I take my memory as far as it would take me. And then when I don't remember something, or I feel like I need more detail than I'm able to capture, especially if a story is located after I left Zambia, then my friends are in trouble. Then there's a lot of, send me pictures of this exact place, send me videos if you can, so that I can watch it and really look. And a lot of the time it's places I haven't been. I haven't spent a lot of time. Obviously, I grew up in Zambia, but the familiarity that you have to places varies. And I don't think many of the stories are actually located in places where I lived for a very long time. It's just places I was interested in, or places that my friends lived, places that I lived for like very brief periods of time. So yeah, some of them were written very long ago, and some of them were written much more recently. I'd say the most recent one was probably the one written as a Twitter conversation, which actually makes sense because I was writing that one, like it's based in Zambia, but not really. Like the entire story is taking place in a digital space. So I suppose that transition makes sense from like when I was fully present in Zambia to like how many years have gone by since I lived there.
I think that what's been really deeply profound for me is we speak often about polyglots, right? And when we speak about African countries, we only speak about one language that we all know. But I think there is a beautiful thing that you do in the book, right? There is a number of the choice of proverbs at the top of each story. It seems like a literary device, right? Sometimes it's a window, sometimes it's a question, sometimes it's a statement, sometimes it's an invitation. But I also think it's also a kind of ode to the diversity of languages in Zambia. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, how proverbs convey a multitude of meaning, right? And also how proverbs are used as a form of storytelling. I think often in our community, they're cautionary tales in some instances. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, about the ode to the diversity of languages in Zambia, but also using proverbs as precursors to short stories, right? And the story that you are told, whether it's asking a question, giving a forewarning, those types of things.
Yeah, you've captured it perfectly. You've captured all the different ways that I was hoping that the proverbs would work in the collection. It is an odd in that Zambia has over 70 different languages. Obviously, I'm not fluent in a lot of them, but I do speak four of them pretty fluently. I wanted to push myself beyond the four that I speak. I wanted the book to be a little bit more representative than just me, like the languages that I speak. I think most Zambians speak at least two languages. Like you said, we'll have the one language that unifies everybody, but then most people also speak one or two other languages. It was also a travel back for me, thinking to like my introduction to storytelling. Specifically in the classroom, I was speaking recently about how when I first went to a government school and encountered the restriction around language, how you were only allowed to speak English, like you couldn't speak any of your mother tongues. And I always think about like our first arrival at school, how some children couldn't speak English at all, and how absurd it was to be given an instruction to only speak English in a language that you don't already understand. So basically, someone is issuing this instruction, you don't even know what they're saying. But while I was there, our teachers we used to have a storytelling time. And in that time, we were allowed to go into our mother tongue. We could tell the story in any language. And I was like going back to that moment of what those stories entailed. And often, like you said, it was possible for a story to be contained in just a proverb. And I really love the flexibility of proverbs. I love that if we go around our virtual room right now and talk about any of the proverbs, we are going to translate them in different ways, depending even on how we are feeling today. And that's what I wanted to convey. But also, it's something that I feel like the proverbs also set the tone for the story because almost all the stories include more than one language. Because if I'm moving around on a Zambian street and somebody is speaking casually, they are very rarely going to just be speaking English. They're going to usually be dipping in and out. English is very widely used, but even with people who are speaking English, like when I'm on calls with my friend, not speaking English completely. And so I wanted it to be the precursor to the short story, but also giving you a clue about the way the short story would be told. So, yeah, thanks for noticing that.
So I think a lot about, especially in this book, how you write as a way to commune or to converse with different versions of people that we know and we love in the past and the present, right? So what does it mean to write for people who may never actually be able to read the stories in the current version?
Honestly, as I've been doing more reflecting of my writing practice, I think a lot of my stories are me having a conversation with my mother, me having a conversation I wish we had. I wonder about the kind of questions I might have asked and the kind of answers that she might have had. Being able to just write the story is enough for me. People reading the story and then conversing with the story, whoever those people are, is the cherry on the top. Just being able to have the space to write the story, have the time. It's such a luxury to have the time to write the story and bring it to its end is the gift for me.
I think it's beautiful that you said that because I think a lot about how this book feels like a love story to Zambian women and girls, but it also feels like writing a love letter to your home country. And I think a lot about the literature of your home country and what writing this book has meant for that. Because you make very particular stylistic choices. So the people who tell the stories in this book are women or young girls. They are Zambian, and that means that they move and they speak and they tell the story in a particular way. But it also feels like having a conversation with Zambia. So I wanted to touch a little bit on those 2 points, right? What it has meant to write the literature of your home country in a particular way that may not have necessarily been reflected in the literature that you interacted with growing up, but also what it means to have written a love story to women who look like you in your country of birth.
I think a good starting point is talking about the literature that I interacted with growing up. And I am very fortunate that because my mother taught English literature, I was just simply surrounded by books. And so I was reading all the time. But very little, if at all, of that was literature by Zambian writers. And I distinctly remember the feeling that I got when I read the first book that I read by a Zambian writer. It was Patchwork by Ellen Banda Aku. And just the feeling of almost like seeing a mirror for the first time, like intuitively knowing what you look like, but having never seen it before. It was like that. Even though the book wasn't necessarily about an experience that I had undergone, just seeing like the textures of Zambia, just seeing like the little nuances in Zambian language or like Zambianisms that people will say that I hadn't seen in other pieces of literature was very liberating. And what it was for me was that reading that book expanded what I thought was possible. And so writing then became about not only the things that I was curious to write about, but the things that I was curious to read about. And I like to say that initially what it used to be was when I would walk through bookstores, or especially like airport bookstores, I used to think, oh, if my book existed, this is where it would go. But that has expanded to now thinking about how much more Zambian literature I would love to see on the bookshelves beyond my names or the few names that are out there right now. And then the second part of your statement about writing a love story to a people, I think it's very heavily influenced by the fact that I was raised by women. There are a lot of very positive male influences in my life, but initially I was raised by my mom. And then my mom died when I was really young. And then I was raised by her sister and her cousins. And then I had my grandmother, and my grandmother has a lot of sisters as well. So I grew up with a lot of positive influences from women in my family. I think one thing I was always aware of is the kind of burdens that they were carrying, even as they were really excelling a lot of the time professionally. And I think often when I'm going into the story, really what I'm thinking is, what if? I'm thinking, what if this a person who exists in this container had asked this question, or what if this person had made this decision? How might things have changed, or how might things have been different? Whether that difference ends up being a positive difference for them or a negative difference for them or the society that they live in, the story reveals that to me. But I think that's always like the thing that I'm contending with.
I'm sure you get this question a lot, but I'm really interested in having written your debut novel, a long form kind of writing, and then your kind of sophomore book is a collection of short stories. There's a lot of genre bending that you do in the collection of short stories, but I think also moving from long form to short form, I'm really interested in what is a difficult process about that, right? Like it sometimes feels like a novel allows you the latitude to do character building, whereas a short story feels racy, right? I want to speak about that, right? Whether there were any challenges moving from long form to short form.
I'd say there were challenges with both. So with the novel, as I had zero publications when I wrote that novel. I was just simply being audacious and thinking I could do it if I try. The novel process involved a lot of learning. I had to seek out the information and the knowledge on how to write the novel that I wanted to write. But in that as well, it meant I had a lot of space to explore the ideas that I wanted to explore. There's a lot of room in a novel to move. You have at least like 70,000 words to tell the story that you wanted to. There's a better opportunity to do character development in a novel. Really, the transition into short stories happened because when I found out that I think it was longlisted, not yet shortlisted, one of my aunts connected me to Ellen Banda Aku, the same author whose book I had read prior to that moment. But one of my aunts just mentioned, oh, do you know this Zambian writer? I know her. I'll connect you to her. And so she agreed to take a call with me. And I was just asking all these questions about writing itself, but also the business of writing. I was particularly like anxious about what to do in that waiting time, like what to do while I waited to hear back from Jacana. And she said, if you can write a novel, you can probably write a short story. And she said, while you wait, just to keep, because I was antsy, right? I was like, what am I going to do at this time? And I thought there's no way I could write a short story. How could I contain a story into such small of a space? But I did it the same way that I went about the novel, which is I went on the internet and sought out information and knowledge on how to write a short story. And I started from there. And I wrote Inswa, and I think I wrote it at the same time that I wrote another short story that isn't included in the collection, but was published in another space. And then I started to really enjoy it because I enjoyed reading short stories. And when I would read short stories, I would think how magical it is that this writer was able to do that within such a short space of time. So then my challenge became like, how do I create that magic? And it led me to so many gorgeous stories. As far as the genre bending goes, a lot of that happened during my MFA. It would be that I have a prompt in class and the prompt feels challenging. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this prompt? For instance, the story about a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a shame to the family, was a prompt to write a story, like a how not to prompt. Like, you remember in the magazines, they would do like how to lose a guy in 10 days, how to get a girl to fall in love with you, whatever it is. And we had to write like the opposite of that, like how not to do something. And I was thinking about how not to disappoint your parents. And eventually it became that. So it would happen a little bit intuitively. Or the story about the students that rebel against their teacher and they start whipping him was because I was in class one evening and my professor said, remember, you have a story due tomorrow. It has to be 700 words or less. Yeah.
So I'm curious because this collection has a lot of women who, for want of a better word, badly behaved. There's something about how you write misbehaving.
They are wanton.
You know what I mean? I love it. I'm so fascinated by misbehaving women because I think you ask us questions around rebellion and compliance. And I guess my question is, why was it important to write about misbehaving women? And what are some of your reflections, having written these stories, on the cost of rebellion and compliance? Because those are questions that you ask of us as the readers.
I, like you, love rebellious women. I love women who don't follow the rules. And I know that stems from I was a very mischievous child. I'm sure my grandma would say that hasn't fully gone away, that I don't always follow the rules. But in terms of the choices that the women make, I think what I was thinking was my observation of the way that we as a society treat issues that especially affect women is that there is a different standard for women who are perceived as being good, women who are perceived as having made the right choices, that those women are undeserving of certain things, right? Ailments, whether it's like a disease, whether it's abuse, whether it's whatever, right? This is like an age-old question. It's like how people will say, whoa, that person was raped. What were they wearing? It's in that line of thinking, right? And I guess with my choices with the kind of rebellion that the women make is that if you say that a certain ailment, a certain state of being, a certain kind of behavior, that it is unkind to women, that then it is unkind to all women, and that it shouldn't matter that those women don't live in the boxes that you have created in your mind. But I've always had a fascination with rebellious women. But my favorite fictional character who I have really fallen in love with is Angelica from the Rugrats. She's my favorite because she's diabolical. But I feel like if you categorize Angelica as just diabolical, you're forgetting that she's 3, actually. And so a lot of her like menace is because she's like seeing the world from a 3-year-old's perspective. But I remember this episode where her mom was like, Angelica's gonna need that in the cutthroat world. Like, this is gonna serve Angelica well. So I'm an Angelica stan. I have Angelica all like my car chain ring is Angelica. She is the epitome of rebelliousness. What would Angelica do in this moment if she was an adult living in this different space and body?
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break.
These stories are really fascinating for me. And I suppose I want to ask a typical book launch question, right? Which is obligations to the wounded, right? It's a really loaded title because you know who are the wounded and what obligations who owes them this obligation. Why you went with that title, particularly because the stories are varied, right? So it's not always an obligation to wounded, but I understand the deeper meaning of what you're writing to. As Amos speaking, it's about this ode to Zambian women and girls, right, who may be pushed to the margins.
Why I chose this title. Titles, I will say my experience so far with titles is that they come to me at the very end. So when I put a book together, I don't always know what the title is going to be. Like the title is the very last thing. And because of that, it can feel very exhausting to me because I've already done all this work. Now I must spend months trying to figure out what the title of this thing is going to be. I just need a blueprint to help me figure it out. But this book, the title was relatively easy. I think I went through maybe 2 or 3 titles before I landed on this one. So the first story in the collection was initially going to be called Obligations to the Wounded. But I was convinced by a class of peers, and I regretted not calling it Obligations to the Wounded. Every person in that story is wounded in some way, and each of them feels like somebody else in their life circle owes them something in order to help them carry this burden. But nobody is showing up the way they need to show up for the next person. In hindsight, I was happy that I didn't use the title for just that story, because once I had put the collection together, I realized that actually this title was one that worked for all the stories in the collection, because there's a way that each person, each narrator in the collection is showing you a wound that they have, and they're also showing you a way that their community has failed to them, but they are also very vulnerable in showing you their imperfections as well. So as much as they're wounded, I like to believe that they're not necessarily like victims in that way. And I felt that Obligations to the Wounded perfectly captured every voice in the story, and I really liked that. But I thought that the cover was in conversation with the title, in that the girl on the cover, you don't see her face, so she could embody many of the different girls in the stories, not just the protagonist. And she's also, you can tell she could be a teenager, but she also could be slightly older, which I like. And she's also looking away from the cover, which is like a lot of the girls and the women in the book, they turn away from what you expect them to do, even sometimes what the character has built up that their personality is. And she's walking a really narrow path, which often when we turn away from our expected roles, that path is narrow in that you don't have a lot of people supporting you on that journey. So in the end, it was just the title that felt as a most honest representation of the stories as a whole.
I think that leads us to so many questions, but I think the one that comes top of mind is a lot of the stories are conversation in liminality, right? So it feels like these women are in this liminal space where they're between multiple things, right? Between being, between not being, etc. And I actually wanted to talk about what it was like to write about women who are in a liminal space, but also writing about transitions in women's lives. Because a lot of these women exist in the gray space of being or becoming or between. And I thought that was a really particularly interesting thematic choice.
Thinking about also making meaning, right? A lot of these kind of characters in the stories are about some kind of finding meaning.
I think the same way that I love women who are rebellious, I think what it is that none of those women are black and white. Like nobody is black and white. And writing a story gives you the opportunity to explore the different like facets of that person beyond either victimhood or even villainhood. I was saying recently how my younger son loves The Lion King. He loves The Lion King, but he loves lions more than anything. More than he even loves The Lion King, he loves lions. And so he knows all the lore about the Lion King, and he's like constantly giving us facts about lions and things like that. And we recently went to watch the Mufasa movie with him. And also he watches The Lion Guard, which is like a spin-off. It has Simba, and then Simba's kid is like the star of that show. But I was saying how it was so interesting watching Scar's villain origin story, right? Like how Scar became a villain. And I've really loved hearing people's point of view about whether his decision was justified and not justified. What I think makes him, to me, what makes Scar the most interesting character in that entire thing is like recognizing how his decisions were justified and were not justified at the same time. How him taking such offense that his brother was like serenading his love interest made no sense on the scale of you can have a love interest and you don't own that love interest. That love interest could choose at any time to be with somebody else. But I think the anger there wasn't necessarily at her, that the anger was that he felt betrayed by his brother. And who wouldn't feel betrayed by their brother in that situation? And a lot of people said, but his reaction to that betrayal was a bit extreme, right? That he put the entire pack at risk and they could have been killed by the other lions. But I think Mufasa's reaction was extreme. That there was a moment after that, after Mufasa has like I know I'm probably ruining it for people who haven't watched it, but after Mufasa has the fight, like the last tussle with the lion, the white lion underwater, Scar has a chance to kill him and he doesn't, right? Like he saves him. And even after he saves him, Mufasa never forgave him. And not only did he not give him, he named him after his one terrible moment. In their relationship, they had only had that one terrible moment. And he labels his brother, who, by the way, saved him when they were children, and is the only reason he was alive at that moment. He names him after the most awful thing that he has done and refuses to give him any other like character traits. And then he banishes him for life. Who wouldn't be a terrible person if you were banished for life? You can't interact with the other lions. Imagine you're just like in a dungeon, you can't interact with the other humans. And then you just called out one day, like, oh yeah, the king has a baby, he's the heir. Come to the celebration of life. I know I'd be a villain. I love breaking apart, though, even the people who are villains in my life. My husband hates this because I'll be like, you know what? I think I get why she's awful to me. I get why she hates me. Because let's take into consideration this. Not that I would like, not that I will forgive them or take them back in my fold, but I think it's just really interesting to figure out what makes people bad or what makes people evil. And that's maybe the liminality that you're talking about. Because sometimes in these stories, my muse is like a person that I hate in my life, right? I'll take that person, I'll be like, why do I hate them? And why do they hate me? Let's break it apart and let's write a story about it. So it comes a little bit of that. I maybe call that meaning making, I'm not sure. But all this to say, Scar is a justified villain. And so are
And
some
your
villains.
hate is justified because it's creating great books.
Yes.
I wanted to speak about the loss of a name. We know that in African societies, names are powerful, right? They're not only a person's name, but oftentimes they are signaling to something. And I wanted to speak about that, right? So just the idea of names being a central theme in the collection, but also the importance of a loss of a name, right? Who are you when you are not this person? Particularly in context of we want better for ourselves, so we leave Zambia to go to America, right? And suddenly you're not Alma Nilisha anymore, but you Emma. And what does that mean?
Gosh, I can already see it. You would be Emma. I have a mild fascination with names. I'm really fascinated by names, but also what way, because I feel like names tell a story of like where the parents were in like mentally when they named the child. And like you said, names are more than just your name. Like they are also telling this, they're telling the story of who you are, where you come from, who your people are. I don't think I had a full appreciation of this when I was in school, but I'm not sure if South Africa had this, but when I was going to school in the 90s, there was a separation of like names, your school names and your home names. So a lot of my classmates had names in English or like their Christian names
Well,
that
the
they
Christian names.
the names that they use at school, and then the names that they use at home. And you would go to like you, if somebody from home, if they came to school, they would say, "Oh, I'm looking for this person." You'd have no idea who they're talking about, and then you'd be like, "Oh, Ida," or whatever her name is. That's who you're talking about. And the same thing would happen at home. I didn't have that. I was given a Christian name. My mom gave me a Christian name, but when I was about, I think I was about no, 8, and my sister was 6. First of all, my sister was struggling to spell Kalimamukwento because she was 6 and it's 14 letters. And her first name had 9 or 10 letters. So she was using her middle name, her Christian name, which had 4 letters. Yes. And we were just writing our Christian names on the books. We were not even writing our last name on the books. And the day my dad saw it, he was livid. And I was explaining myself to him. I was like, listen, sir, this is what people do at school. People have their school name and their home name. I'm not saying you can't call me Mubanga. Mubanga can be my home name. And this other name can be my school name. And he was like, absolutely not. But like I said, I was a white kid. So even if he said that, I was going to continue doing that unless he explained it to me in like a language that I fully understood his logic. Because at the same time, I was like, Mom gave me this name. Like, why do I have this name if you don't want me to use it at all? But my dad said, which was I think it was also him thinking about his own name because he had a Christian name and his Christian name like was the first name he used. But my dad said, listen, if you go to England, where this name is from, and you meet a white English woman called Mubanga, then go ahead and use their names. Because he knew that's never going to happen. That's never going to happen. And I feel I always go back to that, to like, and there's a reason why I was called Mubanga. Like you said, our names don't really have a meaning. There's a story behind them. Even sometimes, even if it isn't the story, like oftentimes with like African names, it will tell you like the position that person was born in. If they were first, if they were the first girl, if they were the first boy, if there was like grief going on in their family at that time, if their mom died when they were born. But I always tell my children too that their names is what will lead them back to the land. If they go there and they introduce themselves as Emma, nobody knows where the name Emma is from in Zambia. But if you go back and you introduce yourself with your name, like the name that your people recognize, you can trace it back. Like I traveled to the village where my grandfather is from, and the name Kalimamukwento is what told people like, oh, okay, I know the person who had this name. They lived in this part of the village. Go ask somebody there and they'll show you the exact place. I can't do that with any other name. And that's why when you read all the literature about the transatlantic slave trade, what's the first thing they would take from them? Their names and their language, because without them, you can't travel back to, but with your name, you can always make your way back. So with my characters, I was very intentional about naming them. Even when I would give them Christian names, like there has to be like a reason to why their parents gave them that name. But yeah, I'm very passionate about names.
Speaking about names, I think a lot about how you've written from the perspective of children. And what's interesting is that you've written from the perspective of children, but it is the adults telling the story of a child's recollection. And there's an interaction of the articulation that children lack, but then writing from a place of imagination, observation, and then recollection. So this is an interesting interaction that takes place. And I wanted to speak about what it is like to write from the perspective of a child with the articulation of an adult, and why doing that interface is important in telling these stories.
I think my interest in children comes from 2 places. Because I experienced, many children around the world have experienced grief at a very young age. But when you experience grief, specifically the loss of a parent when you're really young, it teaches you something about your position in the world and how you're perceived by adults, in that your grief isn't considered or treated as valid as the grief of the older people who are also experiencing their own grief. But there's a way that yours isn't really looked at or asked questions or interrogated. And so I think my recollections of grief are split up between before my mother died and after my mother died, and almost like an abrupt shift that occurred in that I remained a child, but I wasn't a child anymore. There were things that I knew that I shouldn't know at age 10. And so there's that. But also, I think children know, and I've said this before too, maybe I've said this to you, Amma, that children know so much more than they are able to articulate just because they don't have the vocabulary yet. And so I always I'm always really paying attention to the way that children are describing things and what they're trying to tell you in that moment. Right now, the example that comes to mind is my younger son. He's the funny person in the house, so I take a lot of things from what he says. But his doctor had prescribed an appetite inducer because he just wasn't eating. Shortly after he started taking it, he would remind us sometimes, "Hey, you forgot to give it to me." And he says, "Oh, you forgot to give me my hungry medicine." And I thought that was such an apt way of describing it, because what he was saying was before he was taking it, he wasn't hungry. And now that he takes it, he's hungry. And that's what he usually says. He says, "I'm super hungry now." And I just think when you pay attention to the way that kids describe things, they will tell you what they're feeling and what they're thinking. And with this book, the luxury that I have is I have those recollections of myself as a child not being able to express what I wanted to express because I don't have the full vocabulary. But now I'm an adult who can like implant myself into that space and then tell the story. So yeah, I especially love telling stories from the point of view of children because I just feel like children can tell you so much and they're observing so much more because so many of the spaces that we're occupying are brand new for them. So you're not even observing as closely as they are. And I almost want to have a notebook every time my kids are like talking to me and just write down the things that they are saying.
I love that. I also love the fact that you're speaking about grief and how grief fundamentally changes you, especially as a child, which leads me to think about parentification, right? And the idea of this early loss of innocence, right? Particularly for elder African daughters. You suddenly become a parent in a way that I think about it in this way. When I lost my mom, I often think about when people speak about my younger siblings, they exclude me from the loss as if I didn't lose a mother, right? I lost no one. And that parentification is really quite interesting for me, that you step into the shoes of a parent you lost, but you are not able to grieve that parent because you're supposed to step up and be something. So I was interested in kind of this writing of parentification and particularly the loss of innocence for eldest children, but more particularly eldest African daughters.
Yeah, honestly, you put it perfectly. This sort of being excluded from the loss as if you didn't experience it. And I think it also happens in spaces where the parent is still living, but isn't showing up as a parent in whatever way. You see it quite starkly in the first story, Azuba, where her mother was still alive, but because she was absent, she was emotionally neglectful, the daughter still has to take that same position as if the mother had been gone. You see it in a different way in Or a Shame to the Family, in that the daughters are actually the youngest, but the expectations of them take on a different shape than the ones on the sons. And in a sense that when the sons err, like they don't do what the parents expect, they're more easily forgiven than the daughters, even though the daughters are the youngest. And so the burden that is on African daughters shows up whether their parents die or if their parents are emotionally neglectful or they disappear in whatever way, but also on first children. But like you said, first daughters, there's a lot of reasoning of you're a girl. You should, and I used to hear it too, but my father was actually very resistant to that when people would try and rationalize things to me because I was a girl. The one I remember most is learning how to cook nshima, and I wasn't holding the cooking stick. And I remember someone saying, "You're not supposed to hold it like that because only boys hold it like that. And girls are supposed to hold it this way." And me thinking, but then nshima is still going to get cooked. When you taste it, you're not going to know that the person who was holding the cooking stick was holding it like this. Of course, when you give that reasoning as a child, it's, oh, you have an answer for everything, you're stubborn. But my father stepped in and said, what kind of reasoning is that? Because she's a girl. And yeah, you see, and also because that socialization takes place so subtly, like it could come from your parents, but it could come from everywhere. If you misbehave at school, they'll be like, you're a girl, behave yourself.
I honestly want to say one of the reasons I don't want to have children is that I'm really scared about the idea of raising children a particular way, like not gendered, not socialized in any way. create a space for the freedom of children to be themselves and for them to step out into the world that is so socialized and so entrenched. We're thinking about the cultural contextualization in where like it's just you can do whatever you want to do to your baby, but when they step into the world, they're not yours anymore. I will not survive the fact that like my child will come back and say, they say, but I'm a boy, or they say I'm a girl. And I'm just, I'm scared about the idea of that. But this makes me think about familial disappointments being a recurring theme in the collection. But also it means, what does it mean to write about children who disrupt the very fabric of what is expected, right? Like perfection. And we know African children, we know it like you had to be the best, but also you have to be a particular way. And if you're not a particular way, then you are wrong. So it's not even villainous, right? You are a disgrace to the family
Disgrace to the family.
Also engineer, lawyer.
This is not a good space to have that because we have 2 lawyers and a doctor here.
But I think is interesting, speaking to that is, and maybe, before we close, is how Mubanga, even in these themes, writes these stories as a way to reimagine the futures of women who don't comply and conform. Much of these stories are reimagination, right? So we know what the world tells us happens to women who don't comply, who don't conform, who don't tick the boxes. But you write these stories to rebel. Many of these stories are written as a way to reimagination. I wanted to talk about that, what it means to reimagine the futures of women who don't comply. What does it mean to have written the stories in that particular way?
I think there is a part of me that is hoping for my mother, a hope, wishing that she hadn't complied as much as she had. And there's also a part of me that's a little bit maybe holding the mirror up to myself in that I don't usually comply. I think I was generally a disruptive child and needed a bit more like convincing as to why I should follow specific norms. I think I can still be that way. Yeah, there's a reimagination there, but I didn't even realize that I was doing it. I think the only place I remember remembering the reimagination was in Inswa, in that she's based in, I don't think she would have been able to do what she did. Like, I don't think she would have been able to say, even the possibility of I'm going to run away. Like, where are you going to run away to? The country was born last year. Everybody is still trying to figure out their place and things like that. And the same thing in reflections of where the mother ultimately says, it's more important for me to have my child alive than to have my child live in any body that I think that they need to occupy. It happened quite organically, but I think it happened because I'm a rebellious spirit by nature. And so when I'm writing these women, I'm like, she wouldn't do that. Surely she would try and get her own way.
As you can tell, we've absolutely loved Obligations to the Wounded. What do you hope this collection of short stories does, particularly for the people who you wrote about, the Zambian women and girls, but for everybody else who picks up the collection, what do you hope that the book does for you?
Yeah. Let's start from the bigger question going down. My hopes for the book, honestly, is just to exist as an expansion of readers' palette of what it means to experience African literature. Because I think people do have very specific expectations based on what voices they've been reading so far. And there are very few books on the bookshelves in the bookstores by Zambian writers. And I'm very proud to be contributing to that. But also, I believe like bringing it down to the Zambian perspective and maybe the African perspective. I think for Zambian readers and Zambian writers, hopefully what the book does is the same thing that Ellen's book did for me, which is just to show what's possible and give them that courage to go on and write more interesting books, different stories from the Zambian point of view. For the people that I'm actually talking to, like the people who read stories in here and think, oh, that's saying something to me directly, I think that in itself is like evidence of the power of stories. I like to say that when I think about litigation, you and I were speaking about litigation before the interview started, that when I think about litigation, I think litigation is a form of storytelling, in that you, the lawyer, are telling the story of your client to a court, because your client does not speak the language of the courtroom. But because of that, anytime you're trying to achieve justice in a courtroom, like, it can feel very foreign to people. If people step into a courtroom and they're not lawyers, it's like you're speaking all this jargony language that they don't understand. And I think stories are a way to open up a lot of closed spaces, right? I think stories are the space where everybody can enter and contribute something to the story. And just going back to something that you said earlier about the Proverbs, that's why I like to start with Proverbs, because Proverbs are basically an invitation to participate in the story, to make meaning of the story based on what you understood by the proverb. So when somebody reads the proverb and then goes to the story, they are a part of the storytelling process. And you can see this in the way a lot of the stories end, in that they end in an open-ended way. And it's your job to decide what you think the character would have done. And what you think the character would have done tells you something about yourself and not the character.
Thank you so much for this conversation. And we're also excited to see what the book will continue to do. Thank you for writing a love letter to women who look like us, whose stories definitely needed to be told as well. So thank you from the Cheeky Natives. We've absolutely enjoyed this conversation. And we can't wait to converse about your next book, which is coming out soon. Doom, 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 doom.
Yes,
So congratulations.
Yeah.
Congratulations once again, Mubanga. I'm so happy that we were able to have this conversation.
Until next time, Cheeky Natives, we're outie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.